East Anglia is well renowned for its grand late medieval churches. This is St Nicholas's Church in Denston in Suffolk, and it's one of the least visited and least well known of these grand medieval churches. With the exception of the 14th century West Tower, the entirety of St Nicholas's Church was built in one go in the late 15th century. It was begun in the 1470s after the death of John Denston, who was the lord of the manor. The Denston family were lords of the manor since the 14th century. When Sir John Denston died in 1473-1474, his executors, one Sir John Burham and the other Sir John Howard, who would later become the first Duke of Norfolk, beginning the famous Howard dynasty of the Tudor period, they got permission from King Edward IV to found a chantry here and a college of priests. This part of East Anglia was incredibly rich during the late medieval period. The nearby town of Lavenham was wealthier than York or Lincoln. This wealth was funneled into these late medieval churches. This style is known as Perpendicular Gothic. It's a uniquely English style that prioritises volume and light over ornate decoration. If we come through into the porch, we see a beautiful vaulted ceiling. So this vaulted ceiling, again a characteristic part of Perpendicular Gothic architecture, is perhaps the work of Simon Clarke, who designed the church, or is thought to have designed the church, having been an associate of the famous architect John Wastell, working with him not only at Bury St Edmunds Abbey nearby, but also King's College, Cambridge, St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and Eton College. So entering the church through this original 15th century door with its wonderful blind tracery is one of the most remarkable spaces in all of East Anglia. There's a certain stillness and beauty to Perpendicular Gothic architecture. Today is not perhaps the best day to visit as it's not sunny, but when the light pours through the huge windows, notably the clerestory level, allows this to be a chamber of light and glory. So as we enter St Nicholas's Church, we're greeted by one of the church's many incredible treasures. This is the font. It's known as a seven sacrament font because 7 of the 8 panels depict the 7 sacraments of the late medieval Catholic Church, the 8th panel being reserved for a depiction of the crucifixion. So 7 sacrament fonts were thought to be a means by which the church was combating late medieval heresy, in particular the Lollard movement. These were the followers of John Wycliffe, who is known to some as a proto-Protestant martyr. He was extolling the same ideas as Martin Luther would extol only a century before. So why were the particular 7 sacraments shown on the font as a means to combat heresy? Well, one of the things that John Wycliffe and his followers believed was in a universal priesthood of all believers, which is very similar to what Martin Luther believed, and therefore on the eastern panel of this font, we see a depiction of ordination, thus reinstating that the clergy do in fact have important powers distinct from those of the laity. So here in the nave of Denston Church are the exquisite medieval benches, again from the late 15th century when the church was built. On the bench ends are a wide array of medieval depictions of a vast number of animals, such as birds, dogs, lions, elephants, rabbits, etc. These beasts would have had didactic and possibly moral lessons for those late medieval parishioners who would have sat in these benches. However, as the centuries progressed, after the Reformation, it seems that whatever meaning was instilled in these creatures was lost, as the Puritans and Protestants did not attack these bench ends as they did many other with more explicit religious iconography. If we come through here, we reach perhaps one of the more interesting of the medieval bench ends. This is what is thought to be an elephant, although clearly the 15th century craftsman who produced it did never see an elephant. He obviously was going off either a medieval manuscript or a description from someone who had seen one. So St Nicholas's Church is what we have already determined is Perpendicular Gothic architecture. It's also a late medieval form as well as style, being known as a hall church with no clear demarcation between what is the chancel and what is the nave. So the real demarcation was not architectural, but it was part of the furniture, namely the rood screen. However, the upper parts of the rood screen have been removed, probably in the Reformation of the reign of King Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. All that remains, perhaps for structural, or maybe just it was too hard to bring down, is the rood beam. So in the late medieval period, the screen would have emanated up from the dados that remain to the beam, and then on top of the beam would have stood a rood, which is rood being the Anglo-Saxon word for cross. So Christ there would have been a depiction of him on the cross, flanked by John and Mary. This would have been one of the most visceral aspects of late medieval Catholicism, to literally see Christ's suffering. So as I said, the rood screen marked the demarcation between the nave and the chancel. As this was a collegiate church, that meant the chancel was where the college of priests were praying and worshipping on the daily. And so the laity, who would have occupied the nave, were not allowed into this eastern part of the church, hence the reason for these rood screen doors. If we come through these beautiful doors, we enter the chancel, the choir, if you will. This is where the college of priests would have been housed, and they would have sung and worshipped from these benches. In fact, we have few remaining choir stalls. These choir stalls often got rehoused from priories, but these are would have been in this church in the medieval period. This is known as a misericord. So these were seats where the priests would have sat. However, when they were needing to stand, they had these little ledges, which were known as acts of mercy, hence the name misericords. And beneath them, they often had wonderful decorative carvings. On this one, we have a crane, or a stalk, with a stone. So at the eastern end of St Nicholas's Church is the glorious east window. It's filled with fragments of medieval stained glass from the 15th century, as almost everything is inside this church. It's thought that it was produced by the Norwich School of stained glass, which is particularly known for the yellows and the floral patterns. In the window are fragmentary remains of two individuals. We believe these to be John Denston and his wife, who were the patrons of the church in the sense that the church was built for them as a chantry chapel. These medieval fragments of stained glass were reset into the east window after having been located in a variety of windows throughout the church. This occurred in the mid-19th century. It was also during this period when the Union Jack and St George's Cross heraldic symbols were displayed in the east window. That's not original medieval glass. So here, next to the high altar at the east end of the church, are the Cadavre effigies of John and Catherine Denston, the founders of this chantry chapel and rebuilders, the patrons of the church, although obviously after they died their money was bequeathed. So what is a Cadavre effigy? Well, it's part of what is known as a transitoom in the late medieval period. So on top of this monument was a marble stone inlaid with brasses. The brasses have been either iconoclastically damaged or stolen by thieves in the intervening centuries, but on top they would have been portrayed as if they were living, and here underneath they were portrayed as if they were dead. They are wrapped in their burial shrouds. You notice the knots at the top above their heads. This is a memento mori. The purpose of these monuments was to make the living remember that they too will die. They too will face the purgatorial torments of the afterlife, that period between one going to heaven and one leaving earth. And therefore, this memento mori was supposed to make you pray for the deceased, give thanks and pray for them, so they pray for you. So here in the middle of the choir, or chancel, is the brass to Henry Everard and his wife. This dates from the 1520s, so this is one of the last late medieval monuments, or funerary brasses I should say, in England, as in the 1530s monuments like this stopped being commissioned due to the changes in religious practice instituted by King Henry VIII. As you see, the brass inscription that probably would have carried prayers, a late medieval feature for the dead Henry Everard and his wife, has been removed. This was probably by Puritan iconoclasts who were outraged by the Latin and Catholic inscription.